to this. Uh, in one of my occupational incarnations, I was an historian. I got a PhD in history from the University of California at Berkeley. And my wife and I lived in Poland for a year. We lived in Germany for a year. Uh, I left the university in the late 1970s, but I still remained interested. And Jane and I have visited a number of Eastern European countries, mainly in the Balkans. And we talked about that last year in a course. But I'm still interested in these subjects, and we'll see what brings all these peoples together. Uh, One of the things we'll have to do is look at maps, because my feeling is that people are not very familiar with the map of Europe. They sort of know that England's an island and Italy's a boot, but especially American schools have given up on geography. Let me point out, here is Eastern Europe. Maybe today it keeps changing, you know, but you see Poland here is this country here in the middle, close to Germany. There's Berlin as its capital, and it borders on what's now Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. So we'll talk some more, but this will be a lot of the geographic area we talk about, but not the only place. After all, you'll see how Slovakia and Hungary get into the act. And then this little section right here, doesn't even say, but that's Russia, even now. So the question that maybe you can even ask, throw out, how recently have borders changed? You know, it's not something set in stone. If you think about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, all of a sudden, these countries that we're seeing on the map appeared. You know, we had Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova. You see Moldova down here in the south. And other countries not on the map. Georgia, Armenia, things keep changing. And big changes occurred in just even after that. For example, you probably are aware the Russians re-annexed Crimea in 2014. This is something that had been part of the Soviet Union, and they changed the administrative line, so it became part of Ukraine in 1956, but Russia took it back. And as you may be aware, there's a separatist movement in Eastern Ukraine. And we'll talk about that, because I'd like the course to come up to the present. So that's after the Second World War that we have these changes that you see now, some of them. After the First World War, we had enormous changes. And we'll look at another map to see that, where lots of these countries that you see on the map didn't exist. Czechia didn't exist. Slovakia didn't exist. Austria-Hungary was one big country, and so on. And you can go back into the 19th century, Greek independence, Italian independence, Bulgarian independence, formation of Yugoslavia, all those things occurred. Let's see. Why doesn't it want to go forward? Let me ask you, if you can unmute yourself on this. Who are the ethnic groups of Central Europe? I mean, the course is called Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians. Well, who else is in Central Europe? Anybody have some suggestions as whom you might include in those groups? I mean, you can unmute yourself and just throw it out there.
How about the Magyars?
The Magyars, who are the Hungarians.
Yeah.
Who else is there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the Greeks?
The Greeks, yeah, well, there's a problem if we talk about Southern Europe or Central Europe, but the Greeks are certainly there. And until 1921, they were even further into Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
When they were kicked out of Turkey.
You have the Czechs,
the Czechs,
Slovaks, the Romanians.
Okay, Czechs and Slovaks.
I don't know about Austrians, whether you include them or not.
How about the Croats?
Okay, we're talking about the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So we had Czechs, Slovaks, Croats.
Don't forget the Gypsies.
Or now we call them the Roma.
The Roma.
Lithuanians.
And the Tatars.
The Tatars, who used to be called the Mongols, and then they became the Tatars. One of the things that surprised me when you read about this, there are groups that I never heard of. I mean, I used to study this profession. How many of you have run across the Karakajani? When we went, Jane and I spent a couple of weeks in Bulgaria at a music camp. We went to this little town, and they said, "Oh, we're going to have a mixed marriage today, a Bulgarian and a Karakajani." Well, Karakajani are descendants of shepherds who used to cross between Greece and Bulgaria with their herds, but they still have their own identity. Or the Lemkos. The Lemkos are, we would call them Ukrainians. I'm not sure what they would call themselves. But my point is that there are all kinds of groups all over the place, usually based on language. Not always, but usually. One of the things about language, I think, take a country like France. In Brittany, they didn't even speak French until well into the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So it's a real issue as to who the ethnic groups are. So let me go forward. We're only going to talk about some of them. And this question is, where are Central and Eastern Europe? Who defines what they are? So this map suggests a lot of those groups that we were just talking about. There are even the Greeks who are all over the place and used to be way up here. But our big groups are Poles, Ukrainians, and all those dots, what they call the Pale of Jewish Settlement. Until the Nazis embarked upon their killings, Jews were all over the place, interspersed with the other populations. And we'll see that Ukrainians were not necessarily limited to this one area here. In fact, there used to be a group called Ruthenians. Well, the Ruthenians are now somehow became Ukrainians. And we'll look at this map again because it's hard to absorb all that stuff here. My original idea for this course was to talk about minorities in Russia, because we saw this as a multinational empire. It controlled what we now know as Ukraine. It controlled Poland in the 19th century, controlled parts of Romania. But then we run across a place called Galicia. Well, Galicia was in Austria-Hungary. And the Ukrainians claim it. And it was heavily Jewish. And it had Polish administration. So that made me change the focus of the course, because Galicia is really important for the ideologies and the identities of these groups. I got a question about why I was including Jews in this thing, because they're not a nation state, at least not in Central Europe. Well, we have to distinguish between the nation state and a nationality or an ethnic group. Remember, the nation state is something from the 19th century. Before that, these are people living in various empires. The biggest empires were the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Turkish, Ottoman. But then before the 19th century, one of the largest countries in Europe was Poland. And some of you may be aware of this notion of the partitions of Poland by the three surrounding empires. From the 1770s to the 1790s, Poland disappeared. The people did not disappear. So the Poles who lived in Poland also suddenly became Poles living in Russia. And the Jews who thought they lived in Poland or Galicia, well, not Galicia. Jews who lived in Poland all of a sudden became part of either the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The same thing happened with the Ukrainians. And then between the two world wars, everything changed again. You get lots of new states, and we'll talk about where these three groups lived in these new European states. So here's that map again, where this is supposedly 1815 to 1914. So this yellow section here are Poles. This pale, I guess that's a blue, is Ukrainians, although Ukrainians really came into here where it says Slovaks, or there's this white area. We don't know who lived there, but I can tell you that it was a mixed population. Here are the Magyars, the Hungarians, whom Harry mentioned, but lots of Germans live there. Lots of Jews live there. And lots of Romanians live there. In 2021, there's still a conflict between the Hungarians and Romanians as to where the national border should be. To say nothing of the Lithuanians, who become important in our story because they're part of the Pale of Settlement. So lots of Jews lived in Lithuania. And you take a city like, well, I don't know what they call it, Vilnius, Vilno, everybody's got a name for it. They say that in Vilnius, people spoke Yiddish at home, Polish on the street, and Russian with the authorities. So, and maybe the peasants in the surrounding countryside spoke Lithuanian. So it's really a situation that it's very confusing. But I wanted to show you that map because it's just to stare at it. It's just so unfamiliar. By the way, this White Russians is what we call Belarus now. And so these are the White Russians. These are the Great Russians. These are called the Little Russians. And over in Galicia, they're called the Red Russians. Why? I don't know. But that's where they are. Let's go back to Ukraine. And we're going to talk today mainly about Ukrainians and Poles. And then next week, we'll talk about how the Jews fit into this picture. And then the following weeks, how they all interacted. Here's a picture of a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And if you look at Jewish literature, he is, before Hitler, he's probably the most hated man that the literature can think of. And is considered to be responsible for a huge wave of pogroms in 1648 and after in the Polish territories. But if you look at Ukrainians, he's a national hero. He led revolts against some of the Russians. But other Ukrainians see him as a traitor. He gave up too much of Ukraine to the Russians. So depends on who's looking at him. But that name appears and reappears all the time. He was someone who challenged what's called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Remember I said Poland was one of the largest countries in Europe? That was it, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that existed from 1569 when Poland and Lithuania got together to 1772 when the first partition of Poland took place. In 1654, we have Khmelnytsky signing a treaty with the Russians. It's called the Treaty of Pereyaslav. But the point is, it defined the border between Ukraine and Poland. So some people thought that was great. Some Ukrainians thought it was a treason. And it was very controversial. But it's Khmelnytsky again involved. Now, Khmelnytsky was a Cossack. And I think in a lot of people's eyes, certainly in the West, the Cossacks are really vicious, martial people. You know, children are taught, you're as wild as a Cossack. And who they are, they lived in what's now Ukraine. A lot of them, many of them, were escaped serfs. Some were Tartars, these descendants of the Mongols who intermarried, and they formed their own groups mainly in Ukraine and Poland. And what Khmelnytsky was doing was attacking Poles and Jews because he saw them as oppressing the Cossacks. And we'll talk about how their occupational landowning structure did give some credence to that charge. And the Cossacks are organized in what's called a hetmanate. The hetman being the chief man, and probably it's the same word in English, hetman and chieftain. So there you get Khmelnytsky. And after Khmelnytsky, there are other Cossacks who make problems. One of the more well-known ones was a man named Ivan Mazepa. Another one of these guys who's a hero or a villain. He was, what I write here, the hetman of the Zaporozhian host, the host meaning the Cossack settlement in Zaporozhye is an area way down in southern Ukraine. In 1702, despite that 1654 treaty, he led an invasion against Poland. But then he got into a conflict with Peter the Great because he felt that Peter was violating that 1654 treaty. So Mazepa sided with Charles XII of Sweden, who was invading Russia. And here's a picture of Charles XII of Sweden and Mazepa after this, what's considered a decisive battle, where Peter the Great consolidates his control. Peter the Great was the emperor of Russia, the Tsar of Russia in the beginning of the 18th century. And the consequences of his defecting is that Mazepa was excommunicated, and it's never been lifted. He's still under excommunication, but he's a hero to some people. Peter responded by a course of destruction in Zaporozhye. So the Cossacks really suffered from that. And that was the end of the Cossacks as independent political entities, although there are revolts over the next 2 centuries. Mazepa was alienated from Ukrainian historians until 1991. Well, 1991, Ukraine became independent. Well, we needed more heroes. So now there's some Ukrainian historians who talk about him as a hero, just as they talk about Khmelnytsky. So I should mention about Khmelnytsky, there's even a town named after him. And the Russians have a medal, the Order of Khmelnytsky. And the irony is that we've had, in some cases, Jewish generals who've gotten the Order of Khmelnytsky, which is weird. Okay, the partitions of Poland. This really begins this division, these ethnic divisions. As I said before, we'll probably have to look at some maps because it's so confusing. And this one doesn't help with all these colors, but let's take a look. This dark brown is the stuff that was initially taken by Prussia. And it goes on to this area too, what's called South Prussia, dark brown and light brown. And just to show you the controversy, here is Gdańsk or Danzig. For those who are history buffs, you know, this was involved in the outbreak of the Second World War, still in conflict over is it German or Polish. And here, Prussia took some more of this, which we call here New East Prussia. Then Austria-Hungary as it's called, takes all this stuff in light green and dark green. And remember, I talked about Galicia as being important. Well, here's Galicia down here. Also Galicia up here. And then the Russians take all this purple stuff, light purple and dark purple, what they call white Ruthenia, that's Belarus. Red Ruthenia, it's part of Galicia. And these differences exist even today. So when we look at Ukraine, we'll come to that later in the course, but Ukraine after 1991, all the way to the present, the rabid nationalists in Ukraine come from Galicia, Western Ukraine. Some of you may know the Russian separatists have grabbed part of Eastern Ukraine. Well, that was Russian speaking. So here are the partitions. Broadly speaking, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, this whole big thing. And Catherine the Great of Russia, who hated Jews, didn't want them in her empire, all of a sudden got the greatest concentration of Jews in the world. So that's where we have the term Pale of Settlement. I don't know if we use the word pale in any other context. I'm not familiar with it, P-A-L-E. We've used an area. And that's over here, Poland and Ukraine, but with exclusion from certain cities, which become important. Well, Poland never got over this division, as other countries didn't either. And its national mythology lived on. So when people said Poland, they weren't even sure where it is or who lived there, because Poland claimed not only this, what's written here is Poland, but way down here into Ukraine. These are Polish landowners down here. And even today, I remember Jane and I lived in Poland in 1967. And I remember talking to one young Polish man who said he has family property in Lviv, which is in Galicia, but he's not giving it up because they're going to get it back someday. So let's see, there are some chats here. Let me see if there are questions here. The people threw in some other groups, Serbs and Macedonians. That's from Sue Karchmer. She's a Balkan dancer. She's aware of those groups. And then Nancy threw in the Jews, the Roma, and the Tartars were spread out through much of these territories. Those are the messages that I got. So anyway, here we are in Poland, and it's really quite a knock to Polish national consciousness. Poles have retained a nationalist feeling They retained it in the 19th century, they retained it in the 20th century, and it's expressed in various ways, and we'll come back to that. I just mentioned the Pale of Settlement, which consisted of mainly Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians, and lots of them lived in villages that were heavily one or the other. Jews, for example, lived in these villages called shtetl, or shtetls with an English plural, that dealt with that often had market days where Ukrainians would come in to sell their stuff. So that was a lot of contact there. So you have Ukrainian farmers and Jewish settlers. And we have Galicia, because it's in Austria-Hungary. It's got Ukrainian peasants in the east and Polish peasants in the west, and German administrators until finally, after 1867, you get Polish administrators, but the Polish administrators side with the German government. So it's really confused. One example of what's going on in Galicia. In 1846, there was a revolt, not of peasants, revolt of nobles, Polish nobles against the Austro-Hungarian rule. And the peasants, who were Ukrainian or Polish, slaughtered the nobles. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. So it's pre-national feeling. They were loyal to the emperor. So it shows how late some of these feelings emerged. And I should mention that Poles talk about 3 partitions. In 1939, you can talk about a 4th partition between Germany and the Soviet Union. That was the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and we'll talk about that, but I don't want to throw it in and say it's still part of Polish consciousness. Okay, let's look at a little bit about where these ideas come from. The Polish national epic is a long epic poem called Pan Tadeusz. And I'm going to ask Jane to read a little bit of the opening in just a second. Oh, Jane, are you there? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, well, go ahead. Why don't you read this thing from Pan Tadeusz?
Lithuania, my country, you are as good health. How much one should prize you, he only can tell who has lost you. Today, thy beauty in all its splendor I see and describe, for I yearn for thee, Holy Virgin who protectest bright Częstochowa and shinest above the Ostra Gate in Vilna. Thou who dost shelter the castle of Novogródek with its faithful folk, as by miracle thou didst restore me to health in my childhood, when offered by my weeping mother to thy protection, I raised my dead eyelids and could straightway walk to the threshold of thy shrine to thank God for the life returned to me. So by miracle thou wilt return us, Pan Tadeusz, to the bosom of our country.
Thank you. It's a famous first line, Lithuania. Oh, I would translate it, Lithuania, oh my fatherland. This is the Polish national epic that starts off, Lithuania, oh my fatherland. This suggests what they saw were parts of Poland. I should mention here, Częstochowa is in Western Poland, and it's a site of the Black Madonna. This is this Madonna, which is very dark, and it's been damaged by sunlight. In fact, it is only opened a few times a year. And Polish folk tradition says that the frame of the Madonna is taken out and people sort of pay homage to the frame for the Black Madonna. And if those of you are familiar with, here in Pennsylvania, we have the Shrine of Częstochowa in Doylestown. That is, Polish Catholics have set that up as in the tradition. It's a nice place to visit to see how they've reproduced what they think is important from Częstochowa, if you can pronounce it. The other thing that's mentioned here is the Ostra Gate in Vilna. This is a modern picture, the Gate of Dawn. I should say, by the way, that depending on who's saying it, that the city is called Vilnius, Vilna, Vilna, Vilna. Take your pick. Right now, it's Vilnius because it's a Lithuanian city. And I should say that this poem, I didn't write it, is written by Adam Mickiewicz. I'm sorry I didn't put his name on here. And he's claimed as a national poet by the Poles, by the Lithuanians, and by the White Russians. It shows how confusing that is. This poem, Pantadeusz, takes place in 1811, 1812, at the height of the Napoleonic Wars against Russia. And really, Tadeusz, Thaddeus is the English version, is a young Polish noble who's come back from the army. And his family has been feuding with another noble family. And we get a kind of Romeo and Juliet situation where he's in love with someone from the other family. But what we'll talk about more in a minute is a subplot with a revolt of local Poles against Russians. I just wanted to point out in that poem, he mentions the town of Novogródek. And I couldn't resist putting this up here because that's where my grandparents came from. That's my mother's maiden name was Levin. The Levins come from what's called Novorodok, Novogródek. Here we are, 10,000 inhabitants, Jews, Poles, Belarusians, and Tartars. So I just thought an advertisement for myself in there. Here's Adam Mickiewicz, the Polish poet. He's claimed, as I mentioned, by Poles, Lithuanians, and White Russians. He was a student in whatever you want to call this city, arrested for Polish nationalist activities, got out. Later on, he became friends with Alexander Pushkin, who is the Russian national poet. Their relationship cooled as Mickiewicz became involved in Polish nationalist activity. At the time of the Polish uprising in 1830, he was in Western Europe and then went to Paris, and he never returned to Poland. He did all kinds of stuff that we'll see in a minute. Sort of probably believed in his own messianic image. In 1848, he organized Polish volunteers to help Italians fight for liberation from Austria. He's romanticized, although a recent biographer talks about these Polish volunteers as a little band of misfits who marched by train and carriage and on foot, bivouacking, quote, in hotels. So, you know, people have various images of Mickiewicz, but he's still a hero. And it's not, to show you his influence, he has another play called Forefathers' Eve. And it was in 1967, during productions of this play, that the anti-Russian element was played up. And you had riots and a very significant social unrest in Poland in 1967 about a play written 150 years earlier. So the Poles are very much attached to this literary tradition. Anyway, in 1850s, he has this messianic idea that the Poles, the French, and the Jews should become groups of chosen people. And he did have this notion, everyone in the nation a citizen. All citizens are equal before the law. To the Jew or elder brother, respect, brotherhood, complete equality in civil rights. Then in 1855, in the Crimean War, he tried to form a battalion of Polish Jews to fight against Russia in the Crimea. And he died of cholera. And I show you this picture of the charge of the Light Brigade, just to remind you what that Crimean War, how it's we don't know much about the Crimean War, but we, as kids, we all learned about the charge of the Light Brigade, this suicidal charge. There was no battalion of Polish Jews there. Mickiewicz never succeeded in doing that. These are the British rushing to their death in this charge of the Light Brigade. There was a film made in 1999 about the Polish revolt against the occupying Russian garrison. I'm going to play a little bit of this film. The guys in green are Russians. The Poles, you'll see, have been locked up for revolutionary activities. There's just a few subtitles, some subtitles in Italian. It's the only one I can get, but you'll figure out what's going on. It doesn't matter because it's just a short episode, and you'll see how this talks about the noble tradition of single combat. But let's see if we can get this. Okay, well, we had our cowboys and Indians there. It's the Polish image of the revolt against the Russians in, all through the 19th century. The Russians are really considered so vicious. Let me see if we have some other chats. I'm trying to see what we have here. Yeah, we have some discussion of the charge of the Light Brigade. Let's go back for a minute.
Sorry about that.
It says, we're going to go back for a second before we go into the Ukrainians. The Pale, quote, was set up by the Protestant British in Ireland. And anyone who lived outside the Pale or outside the Palisade was Irish Catholic. That's from Libby. That's a good thing to know. Thank you, Libby. And Neville says that it probably comes from the Latin word for stake. Ada talks about Galicia as a northwestern region of Spain. Yeah, it's just a coincidence. It's the same term. Galicia, up in northwestern Spain, is just its own thing with its own language even. And then we have some quotations from the charge of the Light Brigade with some disagreement on how many there were. But okay. Mickiewicz's Poland included Ukraine. For him, that was part of it. On the other hand, the Ukrainian national poet, Taras Shevchenko. Well, Jane, you want to read this from his poem?
Yes. When I am dead, bury me in my beloved Ukraine, my tomb upon a grave mound high, amid the spreading plain, so that the fields, the boundless steppes, the Dnieper's plunging shore, my eyes could see, my ears could hear the mighty river roar. When from Ukraine the Dnieper bears into the deep blue sea, the blood of foes then will I leave. These hills and fertile fields, I'll leave them all and fly away to the abode of God. And then I'll pray, but until that day I know nothing of God. Oh, bury me, then rise ye up and break your heavy chains and water with the tyrant's blood. The freedom you have gained, and in the great new family, the family of the free, with softly spoken kindly word, remember also me.
Okay, I wanted you to see the name Shevchenko and to see his picture. By the way, if you're a Philadelphian, I'm not sure if you're aware of how widespread his fame is. The little park behind Girls High is called Shevchenko Park. You can put that in your list of trivia. I was really amazed to see that one day when I saw it there. I think it's still got that name. Anyway, he's got to do with the awakening of Ukrainian feeling. And then, sometimes the slides don't want to. There we go. Historical Ukraine. He mentioned the Dnieper River in that poem, or Dnieper, as they say in Dnipro in Ukrainian, and the Dniester, and the Buk, or Boch, depending who's talking. Anyway, I've circled these three rivers. They sort of define where Ukraine is. Here's the Dnieper and right through the heartland of Ukraine. The Dniester, some people like to say, is the western border, but the Buk or the Boch, this is the border between Galicia and Ukraine, further north. And I think I showed you last year a book I recently translated about a family along the Bug River, and it was unclear whether they were in Galicia or not, depending on whether they crossed over. But this is the historical Ukraine. And you see how, here's Crimea, how it's really attached to Ukraine geographically. But, you know, it depends. And so, again, I think we just have to keep looking at these maps because it is so confusing to see what's going on. Here's religion as a part of what's going on, because Polish Catholicism is actually inseparable from national identity. Even today in Poland, if you say someone is Polish, they all assume that he's a Roman Catholic. That made it a real problem for a society in which before 1939, millions of Jews lived. So how you became a Pole was really difficult. I wrote on there, rise and fall of, and I spelled it wrong, it's Socinianism. That's the ancestors of Unitarian belief. It was very strong in Poland for a while, and then it dropped away, and you have increased Polish consciousness as the Jesuits helped wipe out the Socinians, or push them out, and Polish Catholicism became embedded in what they did. And so here's that Black Madonna again. It really is the symbol of Polish nationalism and Polish religion at the same time. On the other hand, the Ukrainians, it's a little difficult to say what is the religion of the Ukrainians, because today they can be Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, which is relatively recent. You can be Uniate, which is Orthodox liturgy, and but claiming allegiance to the Roman Catholic Pope. And you can be autocephalous, which is its own separate Ukrainian church without a patriarch, without a Greek or Russian or Ukrainian patriarch across borders. Here is a picture of St. George's Cathedral in Lviv or Lemberg, all the same city. It's the mother church of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Remember, this refers to which patriarch is considered to have authority over them, whether it's Greek or Russian or Ukrainian. Well, now we're going to come to the sort of putting together this first presentation. How do these three groups, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Jews, we haven't talked much about the Jews, we'll talk about them more next week. How did they come together? In the 18th century, the Polish aristocrats grabbed lots of lands in the Ukraine. The Polish aristocrats are called the Szlachta, but Szlachta in Poland is a funny word, because when we think of nobility, we think of this very tiny layer of people in a society. But not in Poland. They think that up to 10% of the Polish population claim to be nobles, Szlachta. So you get poor Szlachta and rich Szlachta. You get great nobles and minor nobles. And this contributes to, in a way, contributes to the anarchy of 18th century Poland, in the sense that all these so-called nobles want to be part of the government. And they used to have the Sejm, which is the Polish parliament in the 18th century. And they had something called the liberum veto. The veto, anybody could get up and veto anything. So it was really difficult to move forward. Meanwhile, the Jews become some of them in the Ukraine become identified as agents of the Polish nobility. They become tax farmers. A tax farmer is someone who says, look, I'll collect the taxes in this region for you, and I'll keep a percentage, and you'll get your taxes. So the Polish nobles are, in a way, one step removed when you use a tax farmer, and they used Jews who did not have any strong, excuse me, strong social basis. So Jews are identified as those tax farmers, and Jews are identified as tavern keepers, because that was one of the occupations that they were allowed to get engaged in. Jane, you want to come in here? Because Jane's going to help me in a minute. Then we have the Cossack revolts and Khmelnytsky. Khmelnytsky is anti-Ukrainian, anti-Jewish. In Galicia, the Jews are loyal subjects of the emperor. And they also have the Polish nobility who get slaughtered by the Ukrainian peasants in 1846. I mentioned that once before. There was this little, here it is, this little Republic of Krakow between 1815 and 1848. It was independent. So they had this little revolt.
I sit back here. Huh?
Yeah. Then after 1867, the Galician administration, the government says, well, we have to deal with the Poles. So they made the Polish landowners the governors of the province. And this puts them against the Ukrainian peasants. Okay, coming to the, almost to the end of this first presentation. And I'd like to point out that Galicia, which I've talked about several times, which is over here, you see where the cursor is not the only contested area. Lithuania has a Polish population too. The White Russians see part of Lithuania as theirs. And the Ukrainians are all over the place. You see these red stripes? And the Ukrainians go way into this area that says Slovak because, you know, it's a mixed population. We don't have to go down a list of all these peoples, but if you look at that map, there's so many different groups, including some that I assume that most people have not heard of, like these down here, the Abkhazians, the Ossetians, and so on. But those whom you have heard of, the Poles and Ukrainians, and this is a modern map, so the Pale of Settlement is not there any longer. But that's where the Jews lived, in this area here. We have one question. One question. Can I pronounce Częstochowa? It's the reason for that funny pronunciation. It's got a letter in it, an E with a little hook on the bottom. We don't have it in English. It's a kind of a nasal, Częstochowa. You can call it Częstochowa if you like. Yeah, Harry?
Well, I have a question about or maybe not a question, about the composition of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I sort of remember the figure like there were 17 different nationalities in that, something like that. It was just, it encompassed everybody that you've been talking about, and maybe some others. But
yeah, and some others who, for example, Ruthenians.
Yeah.
Are they different from the Ukrainians? You can count them. But it says what a problem that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had in governing.
Yeah, sure.
It's actually a subject for another course.
Well, we'll do that some other time. It's an amazing mixture of people. Yes.
Just to review, I wanted to point out, where is Ukraine today? This is a Russian map, so I've added these things here. But it's Volhynia, Podolia, parts of Galicia, and Zaporozhye. This is Ukraine down here. Poland up here, well, actually a little further north, and Russia. I made a mistake here by putting Poland here. It's actually Volhynia. It's also part of Ukraine. And Zaporozhye is not just Ukrainians, lots of Cossacks. Galicia has some of the most rabid nationalists today. I'd like to point out, if you're interested,
Joseph Roth.
considered a major novel in 19th century literature called Radetzky March.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Joseph Roth.
Yeah.
It's originally in German, but it's in English. It's about
Isn't that what
Jews and Germans in a far-off provincial, mud-bespattered town in Galicia. And it really talks about the life in Galicia. And it's a literary masterpiece. It's not a history book. I should point out that the early Ruthenian, quote, Ruthenian nationalism from the clergy. Well, I'm running out of time. We talked about the religion, so we'll talk about that more. I mentioned these already, the various religious items. The last thing I wanted to point out is this Polish national anthem. It suggests, let's look at that English. Poland has not perished yet, so long as we still live. That which alien force has seized, we at saber point shall retrieve. And then the chorus, march, march, Dąbrowski. Now, who's Dąbrowski? General Henryk Dąbrowski led a Polish legion fighting with Napoleon in Italy. So here, even today in 2021, from Italy to Poland, let us now rejoin the nation under thy command. And then I gave the second verse just to show, cross the Vistula and the Warta. These are the two major rivers in Poland. And Poles we shall be. We've been shown by Bonaparte ways to victory. So Napoleon is still in their national anthem. I should point out that the timing of this anthem is very similar to the Star-Spangled Banner, which is 1814, and the Marseillaise, which is the 1790s, which is a really bloodthirsty national anthem. So as a conclusion for today, we're going to sing, Jane and I are going to sing the Polish national anthem.
Here we go. I'm going to sing it.
Are you ready? Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, kiedy my żyjemy. Stąd nam obca przemoc wieła, szablą jedziemy. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, ziemi włoskiej.